If one old man's confession can stop a single person from leaving a child alone tonight, then this is why I'm speaking now. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 66 years old. I have the slow hands of a man who fixed things for a living and the quick memory of a man who learned how not to forget pain. You should know who you're listening to. I am not a preacher, not a hero, and I wasn't particularly brave. I was a boy who watched his family break, and I spent the rest of my life trying to piece the pieces into something that wouldn't cut anyone. Today I'm telling you this because somewhere between the broken plates and the empty rooms, I found what I think we all need, a way to make a promise to someone and somehow keep it, even when the world seems set on breaking you. I was 7 the day I learned that grown-ups could leave. It was not loud like the movies, there was no shouting, no slamming the front door until wood splintered. There was only a pair of shoes at the threshold and a suitcase beside the coat rack. My father put on his coat slowly, as if each movement could be measured and saved for later. My mother stood by the sink, holding a dish towel and pretending not to watch. She kissed me on the forehead, the kind of kiss that smells faintly of coffee and regret. "Be good for your mother," he said to me, and his voice was quieter than usual. He did not look at my mother when he said it. He put the suitcase down, like a punctuation mark, and walked out. Children make sense of things in the wrong order. I thought perhaps he'd gone to get bread. Maybe he had to drive somewhere and would be back before dinner. I curled on the couch with a comic book and waited for footsteps that didn't come. When night arrived without him, the house felt like it had been hollowed out. The clock became an enemy because it moved and didn't fix anything. Divorce is a word adults use when they need to make big hurts sound organized. To me, it was a set of new rules. My mother moved to a smaller apartment. Our Saturday mornings became list of appointments. My father's name gradually became a subject people spoke about with lowered voices. I learned early the weight of don't ask and later. Later became a place that never quite showed up. I grew up watching both of them change into versions of people I hardly recognized. My mother worked 2 shifts and kept a smile that belonged to someone else. She kissed me the way people kiss before saying goodbye to something they love. My father called sometimes, his voice coming through like a radio signal with static. Short, practical, apologetic. The worst part was how other people's eyes changed when they looked at me. Adults wrapped me in a softness that hurt because it reminded me of what I'd lost. Kids whispered and made jokes that stung like cold. School was a place where I learned to hold my breath. People thought I was quiet because I was shy, because I read too much or drew with my sleeves rolled down. The truth was simpler and heavier. I had nothing useful to say that didn't smell like heartbreak. When teachers asked about my home life, I swallowed everything until it turned into a stone in my belly. I perfected the nod that said, "I'm fine," even while my chest felt like a house on fire. As I got older, the promise I made at 7 turned into a vow I didn't know how to speak aloud. I would not let the hollow parts of me become someone else's home. I would build a life so whole that the missing pieces wouldn't echo anymore. It sounds proud when I say it now. Back then it was survival, in the only language I had. I learned skills the hard way. I learned to fix things that break without asking for help, because asking felt like admitting weakness. I learned to read plans and to measure twice and cut once. I worked on roofs, in basements, and on construction sites where men swore like priests and measured out their days with concrete. There, among the cinder blocks and scaffolding, I discovered a strange comfort. Things that were built could be tested and relied upon. Buildings did not leave you because they had an idea to go somewhere else. You could always find the point where a nail met its mark. I became an architect by a crooked path, not because I loved the title, but because I wanted to make sure that when I built something, it stayed standing. I wanted to design places where a child would not look through a window waiting for someone who would not return. I buried the boy who wanted to scream and replaced him with a man who signed contracts and calmed clients. The world rewarded that man with small things: a steady paycheck, a name on a door, a person who respected him at meetings. But the ache never left. Success is a strange bandage. It can cover a wound and make it look neat for a while, but the scar is still there if you touch it. I'm married. I had a daughter. I tried, clumsily, stubbornly, to be different from the image of my parents breaking apart. I kept a light in the hall some nights, left warm soup in the pot, and learned how to apologize without turning it into a weapon. I thought those actions would erase the small boy who had waited by the couch. They didn't. They taught me how to be patient with the parts of myself that were still raw. My daughter grew up without a divorce between her parents. She had something I had once only read about, a routine that held both a mother and a father when it was needed. She held my hand once when she was 7 and asked, "Are you ever scared, Daddy?" I wanted to tell her that some fears stay with you forever, that fear can be a teacher. But I said, sometimes, but that's okay. We keep going. I wanted my voice to be steady for her, to be a harbor she could come home to. And yet the old house in my memory kept visiting me. The way the hallway smelled of lemon oil the day my father left, the echo of his footstep that never returned, the way my mother would sit at the table and rub her hands until they made no sound at all. Those pictures were stubborn. They shaped how I loved. They formed the boundary lines of my anger and my compassion. One afternoon, when my daughter was grown and living in a city I couldn't pronounce the name of, I found a box of letters in the attic. Letters I had sealed away because I thought memory needed preservation. Hidden between old tax receipts and a yellowed school report, I found something that brought back a soundless, sharp grief. A note in a handwriting I recognized before I read it. It was my mother's, and the paper smelled of her perfume, even after all those years. It read like this: "Don't wait for the things that make you small. Build instead. Build a room where a child can be brave." Those words landed like a throw of warm sand. They were not a promise, they were a map. I realized then that while my father had left, my mother had been trying to teach me how to remain. She had been teaching me how to put pieces together, how to make a small, fierce home. Years later, after divorces and arguments that I could not always prevent, after nights spent listening to my daughter's soft breathing and wondering if my hands would be enough, after building a career and a life that tried to be better than the one I was given, I made a decision that was both small and enormous. I began to build places for people who had nowhere steady to go. I started with a single house, then another. I called the first one Hearth. The name was practical and stubborn, like the work itself. The first children who came to Hearth were not my family. They were kids who had been carried through the city by social workers and left at my door with their eyes wide and their backpacks empty. They needed socks and hot meals and someone to tell them, in the way a grown man can, that everything would be okay for tonight. I had promised myself at 7 that I wouldn't let emptiness live inside anyone I could help. The work felt like repayment and rescue at once. Still, there were nights when I would sit in an empty room and hear the echo of that suitcase closing the day my father left. I would think, did I build to forget, or did I build because I could not forgive myself otherwise? The answer was both. Building was prosecution and penance. It was also a confession, structured in brick and wood. I had failed once, and I was trying to fix what I could. It is odd how life arranges lessons. My greatest mistakes taught me structure. My losses taught me shelter. And my daughter's laughter taught me that some promises are kept quietly, without fanfare. I tell you all this not to be remembered as a man who built houses, but as a man who learned to send his pain outward in order to warm another's night. So, here I am now, older and softer,
holding a photograph of a family that doesn't exist the way it did in my childhood. I tell you this because it matters that someone hears it. Maybe you need to know that a broken home does not mean a broken person. Maybe you need to hear that the work of love is slow and sometimes invisible. Tonight, before I leave this room, there's a child upstairs who will sleep under a roof I had a hand in making. Her breathing will be even and small. She will not wake up to an empty doorway. She will not measure the world by the absence of someone who left. She will grow with hands that were taught how to hold. If you're listening and you're young and your parents are arguing or you've already lost something you thought you couldn't live without, hear me when I say it. Your story doesn't finish when a door closes. Sometimes the closing of a door is the first step towards building a better room.
You never forget the first night a stranger trusts you enough to sleep under your roof. That night was quiet, colder than usual. I remember the street light outside bending its yellow glow into the front window of the small house I had just finished renovating. The walls still smelled of fresh paint, the kind that clings to your clothes for days. I was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, when the doorbell rang. It was a social worker, a woman with tired eyes and a folder that looked too heavy for her arms. Beside her stood a boy, maybe 10 years old, thin as a question mark, clutching a plastic bag that held everything he owned. His name was Evan. He didn't speak when I opened the door. He just looked past me as if measuring whether this place was safe. The woman said, "He needs somewhere for the night, maybe longer." I nodded because I knew that look, that small, frightened calculation in a child's eyes. It was the same one I'd carried for years after my father left. After she left, Evan stood in the doorway for a while. He didn't take off his shoes. He didn't look up. I told him there was food in the kitchen and a bed upstairs. Still nothing. So I said quietly, "You can sit wherever you like. This house doesn't have rules yet." That got a small reaction, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, maybe confusion. He walked past me and sat at the table. I slid the plate toward him, and he ate like someone afraid the food might disappear if he blinked. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I checked the locks twice, not because I feared him, but because I feared failing him. I sat on the edge of the couch listening to the old pipes groan and realized I had been holding my breath for hours. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, like it was waiting for me to do something right. Morning brought a slow kind of light. Evan was already awake, sitting by the window. He asked the first question he ever asked me. "Are you going to send me back?" His voice was small, but there was iron underneath it. I said, "Only if you want to go." He shook his head. "They always send me back." That broke something in me, a quiet, careful breaking like glass under cloth. I said, "Then we'll make this home for a while. No one's sending you anywhere." It's strange how fast two people can fall into a rhythm. By the third day, he helped me fix a broken cabinet door. By the end of the week, he was drawing on the walls in pencil, little blueprints, half houses, and crooked rooftops. I told him we'd paint over them later. He smiled for the first time. I didn't. I knew we wouldn't paint over them. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch steps and ask things I wasn't ready to answer. "Why do people leave?" he asked once, staring at a passing car. I said, "Sometimes they don't know how to stay." He thought about that, then said, "I think I'd know." I believed him. Nights were harder. He'd wake from dreams I couldn't see and call out for someone else's name. I'd sit in the hallway outside his door until the house went quiet again. Some nights he'd come sit beside me, silent, holding a blanket around his shoulders.
We never talked about the dreams. We didn't need to. Some pain doesn't need translation. It just needs company. Weeks turned into months. Evan started school nearby. The first report card came home, folded neatly in his pocket. He handed it to me and said, "You should sign it." I wasn't sure why that hit me the way it did, but my hand shook when I wrote my name. It felt like the first time someone had asked me to be something more than a man patching holes in other people's walls. One afternoon, he brought home a small wooden birdhouse from art class. The paint was uneven, the roof a little crooked. He said, "It's for you, so the birds don't get lost." I laughed. But that night, when he wasn't looking, I hung it outside my window. It's still there. Somewhere between helping him with homework and teaching him how to measure wood, I realized that the boy who once waited by the couch for a father who never came back was being given a second chance. Every time Evan smiled, it was as if a nail had found its mark, steadying something that had been shaking for years. But there were still cracks I couldn't see, inside him and inside me. You can build walls straight, roofs level, and floors that don't creak, but people are harder. They shift when you least expect them. They hide their foundations. One rainy evening, I found him sitting on the back steps, soaked through, clutching the plastic bag he'd arrived with months earlier. Inside it was a photo, faded, bent, of a woman and a man. "My parents," he said quietly. "They don't talk no more." I sat beside him, rain soaking through my shirt. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't speak. We just sat there until the storm passed. Sometimes silence is the only language that keeps the roof from falling in. Later that night, when he was asleep, I looked at the photo again. Two people smiling in a way that didn't look staged. I saw myself in it, not in their faces, but in the space between them, the space that once swallowed me whole. And I thought, maybe that's why I built this place. Not to fix what broke in me, but to give someone else a softer version of it. Months later, social services offered to move Evan to a permanent home. They said he was ready. He looked at me and said, "Do I have to go?" I said, "If you want to stay, you can." He smiled. Not the crooked, scared smile from the first night, but something new, something steady. He stayed. That was the first time I realized I wasn't just building houses anymore. I was building people. Brick by brick, meal by meal, promise by promise. And in that quiet realization, the boy I used to be finally started to heal.
There are moments that arrive so quietly you almost miss them. Then later you find they rearrange the furniture of your life. It was a slow autumn afternoon when it happened. The children were doing homework at the long table, their pencils scratching like small, contented insects. I was in the back room counting supplies when a loud crash split the house. The kitchen window had been smashed by a stray baseball. For a second, the house felt fragile in a way I hadn't felt since I was a boy. I ran out, heart thudding, to find two boys at the fence, one apologizing, face red, the other holding the ball, eyes wide. Evan stood by the broken glass, hands clenched, mouth tight. The other boy's father came over quick, furious and loud, using words that cut and left no room for smallness. He wanted his son to apologize. He wanted money for the window. He wanted proof someone was to blame. Evan looked at me like he wanted permission to step away. I walked toward the man and said, "We'll pay for the glass. He'll fix it." My voice was steady, the kind you learn when you have to be. The man scoffed and spat a line about responsibility. The air smelled of wet grass and something older, shame. Evan swallowed. Then he looked at that other father, not the man, but the idea of him, and he said, clear as a bell, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it."
The man grunted, the boy hugged his own knees, and for a moment I thought the storm had passed. Then the man turned to me and said, "And who are you to make that call? You some kind of counselor now?" His words were a challenge. I could have answered with contract talk or with small legalities. Instead, I stepped forward, put my hand on Evan's shoulder, and said, "He's staying." I felt older and firmer in that sentence than I had in years. The man left with his son and a muttered warning. The wind settled and the house breathed again. Evan looked up at me, a question in his face. I expected fear or defiance. Instead, he smiled, small and honest, and said, "Thanks, Robert." I sat down beside him on the porch steps because that felt safer than standing. He leaned his head against my arm, and for a beat, we simply listened to the street. Then, as if trying on a word he'd been rehearsing in secret, he whispered, "Dad." Time did that odd thing. It didn't stop, but it rearranged. The porch light seemed to gild the moment. I felt something inside me unlatch, something I had kept bolted since the day my own father left. The word wasn't perfect. It wasn't loud or ceremonial. It had none of the weight of blood. But it was a bridge. It reached across years and mistakes and said in a single syllable, "I choose you." I don't remember saying anything at first. Words felt inadequate, like trying to fix a roof with a spoon. My hands, old and calloused, trembled as I put them on his shoulders. "If you're willing," I said finally, voice thick, "if you're willing to stay, then I'll learn how to be that for you." He nodded. "I want to stay," he said. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" "Always," I answered. That night, when the house settled and the small lights blinked out one by one, I sat by his door and listened to his breathing. It was steady. It was mine to guard. A man grows up thinking he knows what making a promise feels like. He vows to be different. He swears he won't repeat mistakes. But real promises live in the quiet, at 2 a.m, when you choose to rise and move towards someone who needs you. Rising that night, making sure the window latch was closed, checking the night light, those were the acts that spoke the truth of the word Dad more than any ceremony could. In the weeks that followed, the shape of our days rearranged itself gently around that word. He began to call me when he came home from school. He asked me to teach him how to read plans, how to sand a piece of wood so the grain would sing. He stole apples and hid them under his pillow like tiny treasures. When he missed his mother, he cried into his pillow and then came out with cheeks wet and brave. Each time, I learned how to be present in ways I never practiced, how to sit without lecturing, how to hold space without solving everything, how to say sorry when my old habits hardened into impatience. One afternoon, his teacher called to say he'd stood up for a classmate who was being teased. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "that boy has courage." I felt a strange, bright tenderness then, like the light under glass. The courage wasn't mine to claim alone, but I felt it, as if the architecture of it had roots we planted together. There were hard days. There were afternoons when the specter of my own childhood would rise, when I saw my father's scowl in my reflection, or felt the old empty rooms in my chest. I had to fight my reflexes, to leave when things became difficult, to use work as an excuse, to withdraw in silence. Many times I failed. I snapped at small messes. I forgot to attend a school meeting. I let impatience show. Evan noticed. He forgave me in his way, by returning, by bringing a drawing to replace the thing I'd critiqued, by offering a fist bump as an apology. One evening, when the winter was tough and the heat bills had climbed higher than I had expected, Evan found me at the table with a stack of unpaid notices. He came quietly and sat with me. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just took my hand and squeezed. "We'll figure it out." We always do. He was right. We did figure it out. Slowly,
clumsily, with nights of soup and mended socks, and a fundraiser that surprised even me with how much the neighborhood showed up. That was another thing I hadn't expected. When you hold a place open for someone, other people notice. They offer casseroles and old toys, and sometimes, out of their pockets, a new roll of insulation. Months turned into a year, and the boy who came with a plastic bag of clothes became someone who left mud on the floor and laughter in the hall. He also became someone whose absence would have been a wound I couldn't bear. When he first said "Dad," it rearranged the interior of the house. Later, when he said it in front of the social worker who'd once doubted he could belong, it rearranged my public life too. Saying "Dad" taught me that family is less a list of names than a set of acts. Showing up, fixing the small things, listening when someone tells you their small, secret fears. It taught me that the biggest promises are the ones you keep in the quiet. The nights you don't leave, the mornings you make breakfast, the times you stay when everyone expects you to go. If there was a single lesson that day handed me, it was this. Being a father isn't a title you inherit. It's a set of moments you choose again and again. When Evan called me Dad, he gave me a chance to be a man who finally learned how to stay.
There is a strange mercy in finishing a story out loud. When you say the sentence that was always stuck in your throat, the air around it seems to rearrange itself into something softer. Years passed after Evan called me Dad. He grew, as boys do, into a young man who carried knots of his own, but who also knew the small language of repair, how to mend a hinge without cursing, how to sand an edge until it felt safe to touch. He left for a trade school and then a job, but he returned in the summers to hang curtains and to eat late-night pancakes and to tell someone about the small defeats that made him brave. My daughter called once in a while and sometimes came with her children who ran through hearth like pigeons finding light. She watched me with an expression that was soft and peculiar, not pity, not judgment, but something like astonished peace. "You did good," she said one visit, and for a moment I felt my chest unclench. Sometimes reckoning is as simple as hearing your child say, "You kept the things you promised." There were hard winters, when money was thin and the roof groaned like a complaint. There were nights when my own old reflex, the desire to walk out rather than admit I was tired, rose up like an old ghost. But Evan would find me at the kitchen table with bills and mutter, "We'll figure it out." And the words had the force of a lever. Neighbors brought casseroles. A volunteer fixed the furnace for cheap. People came because Hearth had become more than a house. It had become a place names returned to. Once a man came to the door with a photo in his hand. His face looked like the town had widened it with years and regret. He was not my father. He was someone who had known my father once, a cousin, maybe. And he brought news. My father had died some years back in a town 3 hours away. He said simple, stiff things that my father had asked after me sometimes, that he had worked too much and had been sorry in ways that didn't mend. The man left the photo. I put it on a shelf and looked at it until the edges of the face blurred. Grief is not a thing you close like a book. It is an instrument you learn to play with less tremor. Seeing that photo did not undo the years of boyhood waiting, and it didn't need to. What it did was close a loop that had once kept me circling, and in closing it, it let me step out into a clearer field. In the last decade, Hearth became my life's quiet work. Headlights came and went, volunteers arrived with toolboxes and casseroles.
Children called me names that made my bones glow. Grandpa, Mr. Hayes, Keeper. I was honored in small ways. A plaque at the garden, a newspaper article that said I'd made a difference. That attention surprised me. I never built for applause. I built because a small boy had promised himself he'd do better. One summer evening, when the sky held the color of old photographs, I sat on the porch with Evan, now a man with a wife and a child, his hands scarred from honest labor, his laugh the same crooked thing he had at 10. We watched a group of children chase fireflies near the oak. The world felt utterly ordinary and, in that ordinary, profoundly holy. Evan reached out and squeezed my hand. "You kept your promise," he said simply. I heard more in that sentence than the words held. I heard the echo of the 7-year-old who once vowed against hollow rooms. I heard my mother's hands in the motion of folding a blanket. I thought of the suitcase by the door and how small acts could become the architecture of a life. When I grew too old to climb ladders and my hands began to ask for rest, I started to speak more to younger volunteers, to men who'd lost their own way and found it again through building. I told them the truth I had learned, that making a home is less about blueprints and more about returning, that a room held open with light and patience could be a long apology kept for years. People asked me once what the hardest part was. I said it was simple, forgiving the small betrayals, the times I used work as an excuse, the mornings I let silence do the damage instead of asking for help. Forgiveness was not a single grand event. It was the choice to try again, to make the coffee when the child woke at dawn, to sit when impatience wanted me to walk out. Those tiny acts, repeated, became the scaffolding of everything. On the day I decided to step back from running Hearth full-time, the children made me a banner. It hung over the entrance. "Thank you, Robert." The letters were uneven, crooked, painted by hands that didn't care about neatness because they cared about feeling. I hung the banner in the old way, crooked, imperfect, exactly right. That night, I placed a letter in the old mailbox across the street. Not for anyone in particular, just a piece of paper folded with a pen's scratches. It read, "To the child who waits, you will not wait alone." Then I walked home beneath a sky that was honest and wide. There are things I wish had been different. I wish arguments had been gentler. I wish farewells had more explanations. But wishes are small currency. What matters is the exchange we can make now. Presence for absence, warmth for cold, steadiness for wandering. I chose those exchanges late, perhaps, but deliberately. If you are listening and you have been the one left at a doorway, know this: life does not end when a family falls apart. Sometimes, if you are stubborn and kind enough, you can take the pieces and make something that will shelter somebody else. Sometimes, the house you build for others becomes the home that mends you. I am old now. My hands remember the feel of a nail as if it's a prayer. I awake to birds and the sound of small feet. I hear laughter in rooms that once heard only echoes. When I close my eyes, I don't see the suitcase. I see the light coming through the curtains and a boy who learned to be more than the hurt that made him. If there is one thing I can leave you with, it's this: your past will shape you, but it doesn't have to decide you. You can be the person who stays, the person who fixes, the person who opens the door. Broken homes can build strong hearts, and if you let them, those hearts will keep a whole world warm. Tonight, as I sit on this porch, a child runs by with a paper hat and a grin, and he shouts, "Robert, come play!" I stand up slowly, my knees creaking like old wood, and I go. The game is simple and loud and perfect. I run badly and laugh worse, and in the middle of it all, I understand that the promise I made at 7 was only the beginning of a life that learned how to keep giving. The end is not a place you arrive at with regret. The end, if you live it small and sure, is a house full of light and sounds children make when they know they belong.